On April 5th, 2015, the second half of the seventh season of Mad Men will begin. And by May 17th, it'll all be over. We will know how the story ends. On May 17th, sitting here in late February, it seems so far away, but you can almost taste it. It's coming. April 5th, 2015. The second half of the final season is appropriately subtitled The End of an Era. And it certainly will be. Think of everything that's happened in your life since the show began. I know I binge watched the first 3 seasons and started watching live during the 4th season. And for me, that was one hell of a week off from work to watch those first 3 seasons. And then when season 4 began, having to wait so long between episodes, and then of course so long between seasons, it's maddening. And this previous block of episodes we got, the first half of season 7 called The Beginning, to only get those episodes and then to have to wait a year for the second half of a single season. We last left off in Waterloo, and that episode began with Dawn almost being fired by Jim Cutler, that backstabbing bastard. I do not like Jim Cutler. It went from that to him getting the biggest reprieve of his life, certainly of his career, and actually being part of Roger Sterling finally taking what's his and finally stepping up to become the leader that he needs to be and saving Dawn's ass. So Roger's coup, selling 51% of SC&P to McCann Erickson, was a masterstroke. It's great to see Roger's loyalty. Taking a page from Bert Cooper, but we'll get to Bert Cooper soon. The reason that I'm talking about Mad Men now, when the season doesn't even start for a few weeks, is because AMC released the Season 7 Part 2 trailer. And it's called The Party's Over. And I'm sure you've all seen it on YouTube by now. If you haven't, actually, click the link in the description. How's that? There's so much to talk about, but we're going to go through this quickly. I'd like to say, first of all, that I'm going to be reviewing every episode. I'm going to try to get the reviews up the night they air, so please click subscribe. This is going to be a journey that we're going to want to take together. There's going to be a lot to talk about. The music in the trailer, mind you, we're just talking about the trailer right now. Love Hangover by Diana Ross. Now this song was written and performed in 1975, but it was released March 1976. Does that mean that the season is going to begin in 1976? Waterloo ended in 1969, so are we actually going to jump 7 years ahead? That raises a lot of questions. Or is that the ending point? I mean, if we were going to make that kind of a jump, there'd be so much we missed, but we would get to look into the character's future. The lyrics. If there's a cure for this, I don't want it. If there's a remedy, I'll run from it. Reminds you of anybody we know? So many characters on the show, but particularly Dawn, has known the answer, has known the right thing to do, has known how to make things better for himself, and has given into self-destructive behavior. The examples are too numerous to mention, but if you're a fan of the show, you know what I'm talking about. So the time period. I always assumed that the show would end, and I think Matthew Weiner has, suggested in different interviews that I've seen that the show would end in 1970, maybe like New Year's Eve, 1969. But Weiner is good enough, and we're lucky enough that he was able to tell the story he needed to tell through 1969. And we actually get to go further than that. We get to see what happens to these characters in the 70s. There is a really funny Twitter account about 1980s Don Draper. You could check it out. And the fact that we might get to see what Don Draper is up to in 1976 is very tantalizing. It's a very attractive proposition for me. So we got the full story of the 60s, which is lucky. I mean, in a terrible time stream. This show could have been canceled after a few seasons. So we get to see the entire story of the 1960s and how it related to these characters. Boy, do we get a lot. You know, the Hare Krishnas, Nixon versus Kennedy, John Glenn, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Martin Luther King Jr., the Beatles, etc. We really got a masterclass in 1960s culture. And the show has done so well to capture the feeling of that era that I'm excited to see what they could do with the 70s. I'd love to see what they could do with the 80s, but don't think it's going to happen. So, the trailer is just shots of our characters, probably from the first episode. They seem to be at some sort of a garden party, maybe in California. Of course, that's where Pete's taken up residence. So, the first two we see are Peggy and Pete. Now, Peggy is coming off the high from her Burger Chef pitch, where she fully came into her own. And, you know, though she had to talk to people who just touched the face of God about hamburgers, this was her carousel moment. This was the moment that she absorbed all the best parts of Don Draper, but was able to push out his bad qualities. If we're going to jump ahead 7 years, are we going to see that maybe she's been corrupted by the business? And maybe she's more like Don than she wants to be? So she's learned from the best, and now she is the best. She commanded that room. Even the way she sat in the chair was different. She sat with authority because she's earned it. She's earned her place in the industry as one of the top people in her industry. Her industry. But as Bert's death reminded us, there's always somebody at your heels. There's always that next generation ready to come in and take over, ready to come in and sit in your chair. And as our characters get older, they're going to have to realize that. Pete obviously reinvented himself as a swinging California bachelor. He left his wife, Trudy, played by none other than little Annie Edison herself. And how you walk out on Alison Brie, I don't know. But, oh, Pete. He's finally free of those trappings of suburban fatherhood. Well, he's a lucky man. He is someone who needs the lesson from Bert Cooper that the best things in life are free. You tell me I'm wrong on that. So next we see Sally and Betty. Now Sally passed over the football stud for the younger, nerdier boy. And he's showing her his telescope and she kisses him. And this is right on the heels of her learning a lesson from her father about not being so cynical about life. She just watched someone land on the moon. This is something that's going to change history. It's an event that you could almost look at everything that came before as the beginning and everything that came after as the future, as the now. And it's funny that the first half of the season, called The Beginning, ends with that. Everything that came before that was the beginning. Everything that came after is the now. And Sally, who is perhaps the only person whose opinion matters to Dawn anymore, she and Bobby, to a lesser extent, are becoming mirror images of their parents, particularly Sally. I mean, she's looking more like Betty. She's smoking like Betty. And hopefully she can take the best parts of both of them and not repeat their mistakes. I think she learned a lot from watching her father, a lot of what not to do. But the scene when she saw him with his mistress, with the neighbor, I can't remember her name, and I found that character irritating for some reason. But the scene, more specifically, when he takes the kids to his old house, pardon me, the whorehouse, where he grew up, and just looks at it, and she says, like, why are we in this neighborhood? And he says, this is the house I grew up in. And she just kind of looks at him, she just looks at him, and they look at each other, and then they both look at the house. And in that moment, I think she changed forever, and she understood. And oh, Betty, she really lucked out with Henry, who puts up with all of her BS, even when she gained all the weight. He stuck by her. And I respect that. He was true to her. And, she doesn't deserve him, is my opinion. I think Henry really loves Betty for who she is. And her relationship with Dawn has obviously changed forever, but they're like old friends now who can meet and there's no drama and they just accept each other. Because I don't think either one of them is ever going to change. Henry really does love Betty, and she's far more than just eye candy. You might think at first that that's what he wanted, was a pretty blonde wife, but he really likes her for her, and he accepts her children, and he's being a good father to them. I'll give him that. Speaking of eye candy, the next thing we see is Megan and Dawn. Her confidence and her demeanor. She's happy. She looks happier than I've ever seen her. And Dawn is kind of eyeing her, and he did say when they split up, he said, I was afraid I was going to get fired, and I was embarrassed, and I'm going to move out to California and be with you. And I think he said he was fired, because at the time, he was supposedly in breach of contract, and he didn't know about Roger's coup. And she was just silent, and he knew. And he said, I will always take care of you. I'll do what I can for you. And you got to respect that as well. He accepts it's over, he doesn't fight it, and he does the right thing. He says, whatever you need, I'll take care of you. So I'm interested to see where that relationship goes, and building on that, why is she even still on the show? That's a question that I have. I assume they're officially divorced at this point. Megan's been using her maiden name, and when Dawn offered to move up to California, it was just too little, too late. Next, we see Roger and Joan, and we see some of the guys from around the office. So Roger and Joan. Roger is basically cuckolded into playing second fiddle to Bob Benson, but he's at a point in his life where he doesn't care. He doesn't care at all. He's going to let Bob take Joan. And the more important thing is that he gets to spend time with his son. And I was proud of Roger for taking it on the chin like that and accepting, Joan said, I'll have you in my life, I'll have you in his life, but on my terms. And he accepted it. The old Roger would have fought her, but not the new Roger. So, family and loyalty is what's important, and it's what Roger in Waterloo really embodied. He listened to Bert, and Bert could have voted to oust Dawn, but he said, we have to stick together. Even though he doesn't agree with what Dawn stands for, he had to stand by his guy. And you've got to respect the hell out of that. Bert was one of the old guard. He represented an era even before the era that the show was in. So, we think of this show as being, it was 50 years ago when it started. But Bert came from an era even before that with that old guard. The old money. And Bert and Roger's father, the original Sterling Cooper, Bert's a reminder to Roger of what his father stood for and where he came from. And when Roger lost Lucky Strike, he lost that bit of his identity, that thing that was passed down to him. He never really had to do any work. He just had to manage that one account, which was more than 50% of their income. There's a word they use for it. I can't think of it right now. Of their billings, more than 50% of their billings. I forget exactly how much, but when he lost the Lucky Strike account, he had to take an inventory of himself, and he obviously went off the deep end for a while with the LSD and other things like that. But I really love the character of Roger. He's my boy. When I watch the show, I enjoy any scene with Roger in it. He's just a very intriguing character. The guy who had a second heart attack while trying to brazenly eat a pastrami sandwich in one of the first episodes. He is a very interesting character. So now Bert reminded him how important loyalty is. And he's been reminded how important family is. So he's accepting that he needs to be with his son. And he knows he has to back up Dawn. Because now, with Bert gone, there's no one else to be the adult in the room. Roger has to do it. And the old Roger would have sat back and just said, I'll take my money, or I'll just work half-ass at this. But the new Roger says, I've got to be a leader. I've got to step up. I have my father's name. Bert's gone. I need to step up, and I need to be the man I need to be. I need to be the man I was born to be. I'm now he's now the senior partner, and he's going to let it show. So he goes to McCann Erickson, who everyone was afraid of. No one wanted to work for them. He goes and he sells 51% of SC&P, Sterling Cooper and partners, Cutler and Shaw, and I can't remember the names right now, but they're just and partners. And of course, there's no Draper anymore. I like Sterling Cooper, Draper, Price. I like SCDP. I like that logo, but SC&P is what we're left with. And so now the only person whose name is actually in the company is Roger. So he's taking control. And he gets everybody, including Cutler, to sign on. You've got to admire him for that. So he lost his identity when he lost Lucky Strike, but now he's forged a new identity for himself, and I'm excited to see what he does with it. The whole show, too, since the first heart attack he had, I've been hoping he doesn't die. I've been waiting for it. I've been waiting for that hammer to drop. It hasn't happened yet, and if we're lucky, it won't happen anytime soon. The others we see, of course, Harry Crane finally made a partner, and doors still closing in his face. He didn't sign the papers in time, so he is not part of that final vote. Which way would he have gone? I know he doesn't have a lot of love for Don. I don't think he has any love for Jim Cutler. So we'll never know. We never have to find out. He's always breaking new ground, too. The supercomputer that drove Ginsburg mad, and using television, starting a media department. He works very hard, and he's obviously a very important guy. He's the future of the company. If you think about how media works today, television and computers and market research. But he's not given the respect he deserves, and he's usually a laughingstock. He's usually getting kicked around, and it's his own fault. The way Roger shut him out of that crucial vote, if I'm Harry, that's unforgivable. I mean, it's understandable to me as a viewer, but from his perspective, it's unforgivable. Poor Harry. Ken would love to see more tap dancing. I do like Ken Cosgrove. He's rocking the eye patch. Looks good. Ted's death wish may be granted, as Don talked him out of leaving the agency. And he was saying, once you leave, you're gonna. It's in your blood. Advertising and the work, and the phone calls, and this outlet for what we do. It's a huge part of your identity, and without it, you're going to miss it. And he bought into it. So now Don's going to drag him deeper into his own personal hell and have him keep working. So I know Ted did the right thing and turned down Peggy and went to California with his wife, but I am very interested to see what happens to him because he's done. He almost crashed a plane with clients on it. So now he's still at the company working. And he's a talent. But I'm very curious to see what they do with him in this season. And then, of course, that leaves us with Don. Don Draper. His impassioned pitch to Ted, which we got instead of his Burger Chef pitch, which we thought it was going to be Don delivering another carousel-level performance with the Burger Chef pitch. We got Peggy instead, which was, as I said before, a masterstroke. But we get Don's pitch to Ted about how the work is important, and he's going to miss it, and he's going to lose his identity without it. He gave the pitch to Peggy as a way to not only atone for some of his past sins in general, but more specifically towards her, but also to acknowledge her amazing talent. Now, she was his protege, and he is impressed with her, and she deserves it. She's earned it. So she took what was hers. Without the work, though, would Don Draper have any identity? I mean, is there still a Dick Whitman? I mean, his family knows who he is now. Most of the company knows. I mean, there's rumors. I know Pete knows, Bert knew, Roger knows. But is there even still a Dick Whitman? Could Don even go back to that name, or is he Don Draper for good now? And who is Don Draper? That's been the question of the entire show. Is he the one falling out of the window? Is he the one who's going to jump to his death? A lot of people say that. I personally don't believe it. I may look back on this video on May 17th and say, well, I was wrong, but I don't think the show ends like that. I think that's too easy. So Bert's passing reminds us not only of our own mortality, reminds Don of his mortality, and him soft-shoeing in Don's subconscious, appearing as an apparition, and Don is visibly shaken. You can see the tears sort of in his eyes. It reminds him of his mortality, and it reminds him of the fact that work doesn't have to be your entire life. The best things in life are free. Watching that moon landing, it must have opened everyone's eyes especially specifically in America, but in the world, that anything's possible. And what this show always does reminds us that eras end. And as I said before, with Bert gone, Dawn and Roger have to know that they're next. And it's the new people coming up behind them. Bob Benson scares the hell out of me for some reason. There's something about him that's just off. He's a dark reflection of Don Draper and his lie. And he's obviously someone who's could poise himself to come up and take over for Pete, or could take over for Don down the line. I mean, he's obviously an account man at this point, but definitely a dark mirror. He's the mirror universe, Don Draper, for me. Sally's poised to be the new Betty, and we know that. We know that she's a reflection of her mother. And Don learned firsthand that without the almighty Don Draper, business continues. Sterling Cooper and Partners continued to produce receipts. They continued to bill a respectable amount. They continued to churn out quality work. And we all like to think that we're irreplaceable at our jobs, and without us, the company would fall apart. But it's simply not true. There's always someone who will come up, sit in your chair, and take your position. And that's what Don is really afraid of, I think. The fact that he could be so easily replaced, not only at home. Someone could come in and be a new father, but someone could easily take over his job. So, what good is he? I'd love to see a Mad Men prequel with a young Bert Cooper and a young Roger Sterling, and of course Roger's father, just starting the company. It could be set in the 40s. It's not going to happen. I'd love to see it, but if AMC can pull off Better Call Saul, why not Sterling Cooper? Why not a show called Sterling Cooper? The best things in life are free. I'll leave you with this. His daughter, who he nearly lost, she learned enough from him not to become him. And his son Bobby, who he hardly knows, is headed down the same path. And Gene, poor Gene. I have 3 kids myself, and I know when they talk to me about work-life balance, I know which way that scale always has to tip. Always. There's only one right answer to that question. So the pitch to Ted to stay in the game was selfish and misguided. Ted was going to follow his own drum, he was going to follow his own path and find his own happiness. But instead, he's dragged back into this job that's consumed him and driven him crazy and made him not want to live anymore, made him want to die, because he realizes, the nature of advertising is to create or expose a want or a need, very simply put. It's all about creating desire and exposing, holes in your life and holes in your happiness that you didn't even know you had, that you really don't have, but it exposes them to you, and that's what's disgusting about it a lot of the time. And Don knows this, Ted knows this, Roger knows this, but this is the business they've chosen. So perhaps Ted is the one who has it right all along. The moon landing signaled the end of an era and the beginning of the future. Now, the first half of Season 7 was called The Beginning, which refers in part, as I said, to this moment in history. Sally can't wrap her mind around it quite yet. She's too young. But the moon landing was something that made people stop and take notice. Now, that was Waterloo. That's where we left off. This is what I think is in store for our characters. These are some of the beats that I want to remember as we go into the new season. So on April 5th, we're ready to go. The best things in life are free. This is the lesson that Bert Cooper left us with almost a year ago. Now, we've had a lot of time to think about it, to think about what he meant. Was Don going to wake up on the floor mid-heart attack? Did he lose his mind like Ginsburg? No. I think it's just some wisdom that he's realizing for himself. And he's thinking about his friend Bert. He's thinking about his mentor in some ways. And he's trying to process it. He's processing his own mortality. He's processing the choices he made. And we're about to take the last step in his journey, in our journey together. So I will see you all on April 5th. Please leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think this last half of the season has in store for us. Subscribe so we can take this journey together. And I will see you all on April 5th for the final season premiere of Mad Men. The moon belongs to all of us. Thank you very much.